Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar from Treehouse Medical, All Ears to All Talk, Language Acquisition from Prenatal to 12 Months. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday webinar and for this discussion on language acquisition, particularly from the prenatal stages to the 12-month years of age or 12 months of age, quite frankly. My name is Julia Slanina. I'm the CEO of Treehouse Medical. Treehouse Medical is Canada's first maternal health care management platform for doulas, lactation consultants, and midwives. The only two-way care management platform where providers can securely communicate with their care team and their clients, along with managing their care journey. If you'd like to learn more about how Treehouse can help you or any providers that you seek services from, join us by following us on social media or visiting our website to see how we can help you through your maternal health journey. Today's Wednesday webinar, we are so proud to power today's webinar and have Dr. Christopher Fennell from the University of Ottawa to help us learn more about the science behind rhythms, sounds, and first words. Please feel free to engage with us via the chat throughout the discussion, and we will be happy to moderate the discussion during our Q&A at the end of the talk. So let us know where you're from today. Let us know if you're joining us from Canada, from Ontario, wherever you are watching this broadcast from. We'd love to know where you're from, what brought you to today's talk, and engage in a really kind of lively conversation with you. Dr. Fennell, pardon me, Dr. Christopher Fennell obtained his PhD in developmental psychology from the University of British Columbia and completed his postdoctoral training at Northwestern University. He is currently at the University of Ottawa and is a full professor in the School of Psychology and in the Department of Linguistics. He also holds a research chair in language learning and acquisition at the Official Languages and Bilingualism Institute at the University of Ottawa. His work on language acquisition in infants, particularly those learning two languages, has resulted in publications in top journals and has been well funded by national and international research organizations. He is particularly interested in how monolingual and bilingual infants acquire the sounds of their native languages and how to apply those sounds when learning words. For example, how being able to distinguish similar sounding words like ball and doll. And he's going to have some interesting examples to showcase today during his discussion to really teach us the science behind all of that. So, thank you again for everyone for joining us. Welcome, Dr. Fennell, to our discussion today at the noon hour. And with that, we will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you for the introduction.
You're very
So,
welcome.
let's see if this all works.
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. So, hopefully you can see this from my screen. I'm going to launch right into it. So, launching right into language development as a whole. I just wanted to give you a bit of an intro into what we talk about when we talk about language development. Language pretty much has four parts. The sounds of language, and that's the rhythm, the individual little sounds and words, like was said earlier, ball and doll. I'm talking about the b and d sounds there. Semantics, which is how the words themselves. So the word ball, what does the word ball mean? And then, of course, grammar and pragmatics are more the social aspects of language. And this is the developmental progression. Essentially, babies are focusing in at the very beginning on the sounds of language, the rhythm and the little sounds, and then they progress upwards towards the words. And then a little bit later, they get grammar. And pragmatics comes way down the road. But today, we're only going to focus on those first two parts, phonology, and we're going to end with words. And for me, because I'm an infancy researcher, I'm really interested in the beginnings of language. That's what I'm really passionate about. Where does language start? And so for me, this is a picture of my nephew at about 2.5 and a picture of my father at 65. Well, they're pretty much the same age to me because after two, everything's pretty much set for me since I'm very much interested in the sounds of language and word learning. Those are very much set by two. So, one other quick note that I want to say before I get into prenatal language development is today I'm focusing on what we call oral languages. Sorry, otherwise known as spoken languages, like English, like French, like German, like Japanese. Um, but I want to acknowledge that visual manual languages, sign languages like ASL, LSQ, VSL, and ZSL are equally important part of language development research. I'm just not going to touch on those today, but they are equally important. So the first part of language development that we'll have to talk about if we're talking about spoken languages is hearing. That's the necessary first part. So prenatally, hearing develops around 20 weeks gestation. This varies by child and study, so that's why I have the little symbol of about 20 weeks gestation. At first, only low sounds are heard. This is due to the actual structure of the ear and connections, but also because of the maternal tissue surrounding the fetus, of course. But this range increases over prenatal development in terms of the structure of the ear. So by about 34 weeks gestation, fetuses are quite good at hearing sounds in the same sensitivity range as adults. Having said that, it's not until about 6 months of age that hearing is mostly adult-like. So it is still developing even postnatally till about 6 months of age. And there's some things that don't quite come in until much later, but those are very fine little details. So what can the fetus hear? This combination of immature hearing and maternal tissues means that low sounds are the clearest sounds for the fetus. So essentially, if low sounds are the clearest sounds, what you're getting is the rhythm of speech and some vowel information. Those are the two things that will break through. So hopefully this will work. And I'm just going to play a recreation, and this is very much a recreation, reproduction of what those sounds might sound like. Oh, sorry. There we go.
Yeah, we can't
Oh,
hear that because I think the sound is
sorry.
going into your earphones.
No
So,
worries. I
I know.
apologize. Well, if you want, you can see the clip right there.
Yeah, we have the link here, "Life in the womb before birth."
And skip to 2:30 and you're going to hear it. It's actually, it's very muffled is
Right.
basically what's working. So yes, the earphones help me hear, but not you. Technology. So, oh, sorry. There we go. So hearing is in place, but do fetuses learn anything about language? So you have the hearing, but of course you need to be able to learn the auditory information that's coming in. Definitely. In the late third trimester, a lot of things are happening in terms of learning about language. They can recognize mom's and dad's voice. So we know this prenatally, and I can get into in the Q&A potentially about how we discover these things. Essentially with fetal development, it's mostly about responses via heart rate. The fetal heart rate is the dependent measure. So they recognize mom and dad's voice, but at birth they have a preference for mom's voice over dad's voice. That's not surprising because mom's voice is the clearest. The bones are excellent acoustic conductors. They discriminate and prefer their own language from a language with a different rhythm. So what do I mean by that? English and French, for example, I'll use our two national languages, have different rhythms. English has what we call a strong weak rhythm. So if you're just listening to English, it sort of has a ba 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 rhythm to it. Whereas French has what we call a phrase final rhythm. It's more like ba 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 ba. So languages have different rhythms. Fetuses can discriminate those rhythms, as can newborns, and they have a preference for the rhythm that they heard prenatally. So their maternal language, quite literally. They can also discriminate some vowels. So for example, the vowel difference of ba versus b, they can discriminate those vowels. And at birth, they show surprise to a vowel that's not present in their mom's language. So the language their mom was speaking prenatally. Finally, they can recognize passage. Oh, sorry, I have one other after this. I apologize. So penultimately, they recognize passages at birth that were read to them in late pregnancy. So that's what sort of explains the picture I selected here. So passages that were read frequently by the mother right before birth. When we test a newborn, they have a preference for those passages. We're not saying they understand the words, we're saying they understand the rhythm of the spoken passages. And finally, there's a really cool study from the 80s, actually, which showed that newborns even prefer the theme song of their mother's favorite show at birth. So if mom was watching one particular show that had a theme song regularly, the infants had a preference for that theme song. Once again, it's all about the rhythm. So essentially what I'm saying is that they're born pretty ready for language. Newborns already know their parents' voices, the rhythm of their native language, some vowel information. Newborns also prefer speech over other sounds. So if you present them speech versus a non-speech sound, or even speech played backwards, they prefer speech, normal sounding speech over other sounds. Brain activity measurements that you can do at birth show that the left hemisphere lights up for language, just like us as adults. It's a left hemisphere dominant skill, languages. So it's very much set. Further, newborns of bilingual mothers prefer the rhythm of both languages. So if mom has been speaking two languages throughout pregnancy, their newborn child prefers the rhythm of both of those languages. So essentially, you could be born bilingual if your mom is bilingual. So that's the newborn and prenatal development. But what comes next after birth is to tackle those important individual sounds of words. As I mentioned earlier, those are the two parts that come in first, rhythm and the sounds of words. So I just want to give some examples, and in the introduction you heard one of them, so it's going to be an excellent segue of what do I mean by the sounds of language. For a sound to be important in a language, essentially it must discriminate words. So for example, ball versus doll. Since when I say doll, you look to the doll and not the ball, that means that in English, the sound b and the sound d are extremely important. They discriminate words. Just to give a vowel example, boot versus bat, oo versus ah are therefore important sounds in English. But not all languages share the same sounds. Any of you who are bilingual, trilingual, multilingual know that you have to learn some new sounds when you learn another language. So for example, in French, mud versus goal, bout versus but, that tells you that in French, the sound oo and the sound u are important. That is not important in English. If I say boot versus boot, you don't care as an Anglophone because that's not an important sound difference for you. But in French, it is. It discriminates words. And in Hindi, now I'm not a Hindi speaker, so I'll get this one probably slightly wrong. In Hindi, there are two Ds, for example. So lentil versus branch is doll versus doll. Now, to an Anglophone, to an English speaker, to a Francophone, that doesn't matter because there's only one D sound in each of those languages. But in Hindi, there are two Ds, doll versus doll. So once again, very important. So why am I bringing up these non-native sounds? I'm bringing these up because your baby is better than you at these sounds. Your baby is born as a universal listener. They discriminate nearly all of the sounds from all of the world's languages. So in the first couple of months, they're discriminating the oo, e, even if they're English. They're discriminating the da, da, even if they're English. But they rapidly tune this perception to the sounds of their native language. This occurs by about 4 to 6 months for vowels. So they start attenuating all of that non-native information and start focusing on only the vowels they're hearing by about 4 to 6 months. And by 10 to 12 months, your consonants are pretty much set. So if this baby spends a lot of time with grandma and grandpa, and grandma is an Anglophone speaker and grandpa's an Anglophone speaker, those are some Anglophone sounds up in the corner there, English sounds. This baby is born with all of these sounds, but since she's not hearing the second set, those start to fall away. Those are French sounds, by the way, that I stuck up there. So over time, focusing on English. But let's say grandma is Anglophone and grandpa is Francophone, and they spend a lot of time with baby. So now the baby's hearing a lot of the Francophone sounds that don't exist in English. So hearing those kind of sounds, well, then she will maintain them. So what I want to once again highlight here is that bilinguals maintain a larger set of sounds because it's all about exposure. It's what they're hearing. So now you have the sounds. Now you can put those sounds together to get the words. So how do you find the words? So this is a harder thing than you might imagine. So dad's reading a story to baby here. I just picked a Dr. Seuss quote because why not? Dr. Seuss is awesome. So, and Yertle the turtle, the king of the trees, the king of the air, and the birds and the bees. Now, when you're reading that and when you're listening to me and you know English, that's so obvious. All the sounds, all the words are obvious. And, king, air, birds, such, they just jump right out at you. But if you don't know English, that's what it's like. Because when I'm talking, I'm not putting pauses between my words. I don't talk like and, Yertle, the, right? It's not these very inserted pauses between words. Speech is just this running mess of sounds. So how does the baby figure out where the breaks between the words are? Sorry, this is just another example. So there are no, this is an actual acoustic measure of the word, of the sentence. There are no silences between words. And you can see where you might think the pauses are. So here and here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but those little dips in the waveform, that's not where the breaks between the words are. So there are no reliable pauses there, just to give you an actual measurement there. We call this word segmentation, finding the words. This is a really difficult task. Yet, babies are able to do this by 5 months of age, and it's quite stable by 7 months. So in the first half of the first year, they've already got this really hard thing down pat, pretty much. And how do they do that? Well, rhythm helps because, for example, there are pauses between what we call phrases. So sentences, phrases, we do put pauses there. And also word statistics. And what I mean by this is if they hear pretty baby, and there's no pause between pretty and baby, well, the sound the sound T follows the sound very frequently because pretty is a word. There's not very many other words that start with so we might have prepare, right? But pr and T go together a lot. Bay is very frequently followed by B in baby speech to babies. So those two things go together a lot. But T-bay don't go together as much because I might say pretty car, pretty day, pretty dog, pretty plate. So there's a much lower frequency, and babies are excellent statisticians. They track frequency beautifully. So they are tracking these frequent combinations and the words start jumping out. So now that they can break the words out of this steady stream, they can start the actual journey of word learning once you have the words. So what I'm talking about here is connecting words to things in the world. So at 6 months of age, researchers can show that infants already understand very common words in their environment. And this is a really cool study done by a colleague of mine in the United States, Elika Bergelson. And what she looked at was, can babies look to the correct object when they hear a word? And she picked two very common word categories for babies. Babies hear a lot of food words and they hear a lot of body part words. So at mealtime, at bath time, parents are often labeling what is going on. And so essentially, she would show these kinds of images and say, where does the infant look when they hear foot, ear, and nose, for example? So they see a foot, they see a glass of milk, and they hear foot. Well, these 6-month-olds look reliably and statistically longer to the foot than the milk. Same with ear, same with nose, and it would be vice versa, of course, if I did milk, spoon, and juice. So what this is showing is in the lab, we're already showing that they have words at 6 months. Of course, that means they already have them at home before 6 months. Over time, those words get very detailed in terms of their sounds. So by 11 months of age, babies have familiar words locked down in terms of their sound detail. So we know this by doing the same type of study. So if I say, baby, look at the baby, and what's on the screen is a baby in a car, well, the baby at 11 months is going to, of course, look to the baby. But what if I mispronounce the word baby? What if I say instead, baby, look at the baby? If that occurs, what you see is they look less in this condition to the baby than in the correctly pronounced condition. So if they hear baby, yes, they still look longer to the baby than to the car, but the time they look to baby when they hear baby is much less than baby when they hear the actual word baby, the correctly pronounced word baby. So what this means is by the end of the first year, these words are getting very, very detailed in terms of their sounds. So what you'll notice is that what I've talked about so far is all about comprehension, all about what the baby knows. And the reason why is that comprehension always precedes production. Think about when you're, as an adult, learning a second language, you always understand more than what you could say. Well, it's the same thing in your first language as an infant. But let's now move to production. Essentially, production is comprehension, redux. It's the same order as we saw in comprehension, but now in production. So in production, we see the following stages. At the very beginning, birth to 2 months, it's just reflexive vocalizations. Essentially, gurgles, cries, burps. This is what you're seeing birth to 2 months. Starting about 2 months, from 2 to 4 months, you start to see what we call cooing. Cooing are essentially the vowels. The vowels are starting to be produced because it's like sounds like ah, ah. At 4 to 6 months, you start to see what we call vocal play. It's cooing just with modulation. So instead of ah, you start to hear things like ah. So start to play with it. Starting around 6 months, we see what we call canonical babbling. It's what you would think of as babbling, traditionally. And what I mean by that is you're starting to see the consonants come into. So ba 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 ba, da di da di da di da, those kind of things. And then even cooler to me is that around 10 months, you start to see what we call conversational babbling, where the baby and the parent are having a conversation, but the baby's just babbling. So dad might say, oh, what did you do today? To a 10-month-old. And the 10-month-old will pause, wait for dad to finish, look up and go, ba-da, ba-da, ba. And it's a conversation back and forth. So you're already seeing some of this social stuff coming in at 10 months of age. In terms of babbling, we see the same thing that we saw with comprehension in the sense that babies start off babbling with all of these different sounds from a bunch of different languages. But over time, their babbling narrows to their native language. So an English baby might start babbling with sounds like bu, like a French sound, but by the time they're in the later canonical babbling stage, it's only English sounds. I'll just skip that point there. Oh, I won't skip it. That's actually sort of fun. So the other thing you see is that babies even cry in the rhythm of their own language. This is a study done with French and German babies. So French babies cry with that raise I talked about before. So when they're crying, it's like a going up. and German babies were crying like the English rhythm, because German and English sound the same in terms of rhythm. So it's more like ah, ah, so a fall. So rhythm of language even translates to their cries, which is really cool. And the other thing I want to say is that after a baby produces their first word, babbling does continue. So babbling continues for 4 to 5 months after the first word. It's not like a baby says their first word and they don't babble anymore. This is a gradual transition from babbling to words, words only. It's a very gradual transition. So let's talk about those first words in production. First word in comprehension, like I said, comes in around 6 months. First word in production is at approximately 12 months across language and cultures. So that's a 6-month difference. So a baby has words in their comprehensive vocabulary before they can produce them by about 6 months. So I always like to highlight that, because just because a baby's not saying anything doesn't mean they don't have language. They have rich language, even if they're not saying anything yet. And this is very stable across languages and cultures, across bilingualism. So bilinguals produce their first word at the same time as well. Infants learning sign language produce their first word around the same time. So it's a very stable finding. Having said that, there is huge individual variation in production of first word. In the scientific literature, we don't consider it atypical until after 2.5 years of age. So if a baby produces their first word at 2, that is still typical for us. That is not atypical at all. It's only past 2.5 that we consider it atypical. So I always want to highlight as well the huge individual variation in the production of first word. Finally, in terms of first words, the other thing to highlight is the very first words are sometimes what we call context bound. What that means is the baby will say the word only in a certain context. So let's say the baby starts saying the word duck, but what they're really referring to is their duck in the bathtub, their toy duck in the bathtub. And if they see a real duck, they don't say duck. If they see a picture of a duck, they don't say duck. They see another toy duck, but in a store, they don't say duck. It's very context bound sometimes, these very first words. It doesn't last for very long, but at the very beginning, they can be context bound. And what's interesting is it's related to mom's most frequent use. So if mom says duck a lot at bath time, that is when the baby will say duck. And the last two things I'm going to say is about the input. People often ask those of us that study language development, what can I do to improve language development? And essentially, the most basic advice one can give is it's all about amount. Like real estate's all about location. Language development's about amount. And what I mean by that is the more a kid hears, the better their language development. So essentially, my advice is just talk a lot. Even when it seems ridiculous to talk, just talk. Have conversations all the time. Why? Because the amount is related to vocabulary size. It even predicts the speed at which an infant recognizes a word. So it's very much tied to this amount and speed, like the quickness of recognition. So it's all about input, essentially. In bilinguals, for example, if a bilingual gets about 30% French and 70% English, well, their first words are going to be about 30% French and about 70% English. It even maps onto that beautiful amount of detail in terms of bilingualism. That's not to say, complexity and exchanges don't matter. They do. What I mean by complexity is moms that use more complex sentences. When kids hit their grammar stage, their kids have more complex grammar. And by exchanges, I mean back and forth conversations. That improves their conversational development. So there are other factors here, but overall, my biggest advice is just talk a lot. And the last thing I'm going to say is about speech preferences. What do babies like to listen to? Infant-directed speech is what the fancy scientific term for what we would call baby talk. The talk where we talk with a high pitch, variable pitch, and short sentences. So adult talk, look at the dog. Baby talk, look at the dog. That's the difference I'm talking about. Babies prefer this kind of speech style over adult-like speech. They will choose to listen to that kind of speech over my boring type of speech I'm doing right now as an adult. Why? it captures attention, and it doesn't. And that, this makes a lot of sense because the variable pitch, that variable pitch and high pitch captures their attention, so they actually focus more on the infant-directed speech. And this infant-directed speech, over many different studies, has shown we have shown support for language learning in the literature. If a baby is listening to stimuli in infant-directed speech over adult-directed speech, they show better discrimination of language sounds. They show better word segmentation. They show increased word learning, and they show increased recognition of known words. So this is very much something that that helps language development. Does that mean that you should talk all the time to your baby in baby talk? No, because we don't do that naturally. But don't have any fear of baby talk is what my big thing here is, that it really is something that is universal, is universally preferred over many different languages and cultures, and it definitely has advantages. And I will end there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fennell. I think that was a really comprehensive talk. I learned a lot about the science behind it. I know that I talk a lot, oftentimes too much. So I talked a lot during my pregnancy, a lot. So hopefully that helped my child as well. But before we step into the Q&A, I'm going to encourage everyone again to engage with us and let us know if you have any questions related to um, some of your lifestyle related to language acquisition, maybe to your about your own children, or maybe the children you care for, or maybe even the mothers or the families that you care for. I think maybe just to kind of get the Q&A started, I'll engage with some questions and see kind of how we progress over the next few minutes. But one of the last slides you talked about was IDS, was this infant directed speech. Um, and so, we do this almost naturally when our children are babies. But is there a time that we should really maybe ease off on IDS and think about showing them the difference between the variation in voice?
So I always say that that just comes naturally for the most part. That infant-directed speech, this baby talk, is
Yeah.
what we call a speech register, and there's many different kinds of speech registers. A register is just how we talk in different social situations, essentially.
Mhm.
And so when I talk about this with my class, I always give the example of I wouldn't use baby talk when I speak to the president of my university. But I would also speak to the president of my university differently than I would speak to my best friend. We have very different ways of talking to different people.
Mhm.
And we are very good at that as humans. And so I always say, trust your instincts on some level. It's a
Yeah.
transition. Like you
Right.
talk baby talk to your 2 month old way more than to your 20-month old,
Mhm.
even, right? Because you're
Yeah.
transitioning naturally into a more adult type of talk. And I want to highlight that sort of naturalness because a lot of people argue that this infant directed speech is actually innate to us as humans.
Mhm.
Like we do this as humans because it's found across pretty much all cultures. It's found across all languages. Even 4-year-old toddlers talk to babies in baby talk. Like so
Yeah.
it's something that we just do. But we know when to stop it as well. That
Yeah.
we won't
Hopefully anyway.
overuse it. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Another question is, uh, are children, or not children, but really infants, newborns, up into that 12-month age range, are they able to hear the difference between negative and positive sounds? So, versus something where I'm maybe speaking really nicely to them versus a little bit more stern. Can they hear, or if there's a someone in the room that is having an argument and sounds very angry or frustrated? Maybe you can talk about the differences in sound between negative and positive sounds.
Yeah, I definitely know a little bit less about the emotionality aspects of speech,
Okay. Mhm.
but I always put that out there. I'm always somebody that fully admits to the limits of my own knowledge. I always tell the students, never be afraid to say, I'm not fully informed on this.
Yeah.
But uh, in terms of emotionality,
Mhm.
it's tied to the rhythm of language. So it's all, how you speak aggressively, argumentatively, positively, sadly, all of those things have a rhythm, just like what I talked about with languages. So if I'm
Mhm.
talking happily, it's higher pitch and all that. If I'm talking angrily, it's lower pitch and more short sentences.
Yeah.
So if these babies are clued into rhythm, third trimester even, you can imagine how they'd be very good at detecting rhythmic differences in terms of emotionality too.
Okay.
When do they connect the two? That I'm not sure of, but I can say that they are good at recognizing emotions, the
Mhm.
base emotions, very early in the first year as well. So happy versus sad, all of these things, angry, the base emotions, we can
Okay.
show infant recognition of those emotions via the face, for example, by in the first half of the first year of life. So
Okay.
if you put those two pieces of information together, wink, wink, they probably go together a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. And some of those base emotions are happy, sad, angry.
yeah,
So something that they can actually tell
e-
from a face. Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Disgust is another
Did,
one.
oh, okay.
Which makes a lot of evolutionary sense. You want to be able to read that emotion pretty quickly for food and stuff like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But for example, consternation or guilt, those ones probably much later in development.
Guilt's too bad. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe that's why we don't see babies at jury trials.
exactly.
Yeah. Um, now we talked a little bit about the stages of the way that they vocalize, right? And one of your slides kind of highlighted that. Um, does that impact any way of their personality? So if I have an infant that is more on the shy side, and you can visibly see that, by the time they're 12 months, versus an infant that is more outgoing, does that have anything to do with vocalization?
With vocalization, not quite sure about the vocalization in terms of babbling,
Hmm.
but in terms of vocabulary, if we go
Hmm.
up a level to vocabulary, excuse me, you do start to see um, differences in terms of outgoingness. So shy versus outgoing individuals, you start to see differences in terms of their vocabulary. Now, those differences become much clearer later in development, right? Because what you're seeing is the ability to see a range now, like a very variable. It's hard to see. What I'm trying to convey here is it's hard to see variation when you only have 10 words. But if
Right.
you have 300 words, now you can start to see there's differences. And what the differences are is that shy individuals have smaller vocabularies on average. Oh, that's something I should have said earlier as well. Very quick segue, sorry, tangent.
Yeah.
Um, everything I'm talking about is averages. Everything I'm talking about is averages. Individuals differ. So if I say one group over another, you always remember that they're group averages. So it doesn't mean that necessarily that one individual who's shy is got, right? But
Yeah.
anyway. So shy individuals have smaller vocabularies, more outgoing individuals have larger vocabularies. And this makes sense because outgoing individuals, remember when I talked about input, input, input,
Right.
outgoing individuals get the input. They're striking up conversations with
Yeah.
other people, even at one. They're striking up conversations with other
Of course.
people,
Yeah. Yeah.
essentially saying hi, right? And that means these people are talking to them. A reserved person is not affording themselves those same opportunities. And so that's where this comes in. It ties the explanatory factor is still the input in the end, in that outgoing individuals are engendering more, getting more input because they're reaching out to people to get it, essentially.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a few questions coming in through the Q&A. One of them is, will sign language ease language comprehension or production?
I assume the question relates to the baby sign aspect. So this is something that is, you know, somewhat popular in North America, of using baby signs to facilitate communication with the infant.
Mhm.
Uh, One thing I always highlight at the very beginning is that baby sign and sign language are not the same thing. So sign language is a language. So
Mhm.
ASL,
Yeah.
LSQ, these are actual languages. Baby sign are isolated gestures. So always want to highlight that difference. Um, but baby sign has a couple of things going for it. What baby sign has going for it is um, I'm trying to think of the best word for this, but an ease of communication between parent and infant, so that if the parent can get a point across or the infant can get a point across via sign before they can produce the word. So if they know the sign for the baby sign, once again,
Mhm.
focusing on baby sign, the baby sign for more, which I'm not sure what that is, but the sign for more, and the parent can understand it, there's an ease of communication there. So I always say, like, that's awesome. Like, if a parent and a child has more ease of communication, great. Does baby sign enhance language development? There is not definitive proof for that. There's not. There's been some meta-analyses done. Those are sort of like analyses where you put a bunch of data from different studies in the same pile of data and then run analyses,
Mhm.
and not showing any differences. But that's not to say but baby sign's not harmful for language development. You know what I'm trying to go here? Like,
Mhm.
there's no drawback in the sense that it doesn't hurt language development, but there's
Right.
just not evidence that it enhances language development. What it enhances is this ease of communication between parent and child.
I
Does
see.
that does that make sense?
And we actually had a
Yeah,
kind of a follow-up on that. The individual said,
yeah.
"I am referring to sign language, for example, hearing child of deaf parent, but information on this is
Oh,
great. Thanks." As well.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, I went right down the baby sign route because that's
Yeah.
usually the question I get. I
Yeah.
should never assume. So a hearing child of deaf individuals
Mhm.
usually grows up bilingually because usually there's also the spoken language in the greater environment and all that. So they're
Mhm.
getting, let's say they're getting ASL at home and American English from aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins and the greater world. So typically these are what we call bimodal bilinguals because they are bilingual across both manual and auditory modes. And those bimodal bilinguals look like just like every other bilingual. So they produce their first word at around 12 months. They are so the cool thing about these individuals though is that besides just they're a really cool type of bilingual, is that a bimodal bilingual is the only bilingual that can literally speak both languages simultaneously. And so you can look at really cool things with these kind of bilinguals because they're the only, I cannot speak English and French at the exact same time, but I can speak English and ASL at the exact same time. So
Mhm.
that's the really neat thing. And yes, those individuals look exactly the same as every other bilingual. There's no difference really.
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you. I hope that answers your question. Another question coming through is amazing event. Thank you. What is the connection between speaking and reading? Do children with a delay experience more issues with literacy? Do early speakers have an easier time? And then there's some follow up as well, but I'll let you
Yeah.
touch on that first.
So I'll talk about it in terms of vocabulary rather than speaking, because why I'm going to say it that way is because that's where the most direct connections are. So if a child has a larger spoken vocabulary, yes, there are connections to literacy development. But the interesting thing there is it becomes a bit of a chicken and an egg problem as you progress because somebody that has more words is also going to acquire more words through reading, which then gives them that if they're good at vocabulary, then they're good at reading, then they're going to be better at vocabulary. It's like this circular effect, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
they're better at vocabulary, they're better at reading. That means you're going to get more words, which will enhance the reading. So this lovely sort of this sort of circle of improvements essentially. And so in that sense, yes, and also in the sense of what we call phonological awareness. And phonological awareness is a child's ability to deconstruct words into their constituent sounds. So a child, if I say, do bat and cat rhyme? And they say yes, that's showing a measure of phonological awareness because they realize they could take the B and the K, like the B and the K, and just have the at. If I say, how many sounds are in bat? And around 6, they can start doing their 3 sounds, right? That's phonological awareness. That has a direct relationship to ability to read in what we call alphabetic languages like English, like French, languages that use an alphabet.
Mhm.
Less of a relationship to languages that don't use an alphabet, like Mandarin, like Cantonese, where one symbol is a whole word, so it's not alphabetized like our languages are. So yes, in terms of spoken language vocabulary, it does have a relationship with literacy development later on in that sense.
Okay. And to follow up to that, and actually, Dr. Fennel and I were discussing this. The viewer is asking, "I've read that firstborns usually have better speech. How do you overcome this if a toddler who is still learning and a newborn at home at the same time? Less time with one. How does it work? We talked about it this week. Good luck. Yeah, let's tell
Well,
everybody.
whoever submit that question is already already like knows the entire literature essentially. Like this is where I love that parents are like ahead of us as researchers sometimes. Of like, of course we know this as parents. Um, so um, firstborns, on average, once again I always say on average, firstborns have increased vocabulary sizes compared to second, third, fourth, fifth borns. So the firstborn has increased vocabulary. Now, why might that be? Well, first off, they get a running head start with mom and dad, or mom and dad. They have a running head start that they get all the attention. So they're getting all of this input to themselves. And then, as was just highlighted, you might say, okay, second born comes in. So why are they not getting the same amount of attention? Well, they're not getting the same amount of attention because firstborn, let's say, is 1.5 and has words and can talk. And so they're actually engaging mom more. And so that poor newborn who's just gurgling and babbling over here, and the 1.5-year-old is having a whole conversation, they're still not manipulating, monopolizing. Maybe they're manipulating too, monopolizing the attentional focus in the words, and they're getting more words. So that is why firstborns actually have increased vocabulary. But, and of course, as a firstborn, I'm very proud of that. But
Me
to give
too.
the second,
Yeah.
the second, third, fourth, fifth borns, they have an advantage over us firstborns. And that advantage is in conversational development. And so second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh borns are better conversationalists than firstborns. And why? Because they have, you think of it in reverse in some ways, they have to compete for that attention a bit. There's more people to go around. So they're better at the social conversations later on. So not all rosy as firstborns.
Right. Yeah. Another question with regards to the sign language. Does sign language understanding use the same process um, as language development?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So in terms of the neuroscience of language development of sign languages versus spoken languages, they're overall very similar in terms of, for example, left hemisphere focus, right? That it's in the left hemisphere. Um, so process very linguistic information, the language type structure, because sign languages have phonology, they have words, they have grammar, right?
Hmm.
These kind of things are processed in a very similar way. But there are differences because spoken language, of course, is auditory, whereas sign languages are visual manual. So using vision and hands.
Hmm.
And so you need to have more visuospatial skills to process the information. And so in that sense, you see a bit more right hemisphere involvement because visuospatial information is in the right hemisphere in sign language over spoken language. So there are some little differences as well because the modes of information are different. The input is different. Um, so overall, very similar, but because the input is different in terms of the senses used and some of the skills used, you do see a little bit of difference there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All really great questions.
Mhm.
If you can't think of any questions, or maybe you think of questions later on down the road, feel free to email us at info@treehousemedical.ca. You could also get directly in touch with Dr. Fennel. We'd be happy to share some of his contact information after this webinar. If you'd like, additionally, a copy of this webinar, you can email us directly. And we would be happy to share that with you and follow up if you require any further attention. Or getting another, it's not a question, but again, thank you so much for the chat. Have to head back to work, but appreciate the information. So thank you for taking the time out of your day, everyone. We're getting to the top of the hour. I'll let Dr. Fennel, say if he has any other kind of further remarks. We'll be here for a few more minutes to answer any questions that might come up. We're really thankful that everyone is here and taking the time out of their day in the middle of the day. We try to plan them in the middle of the day, typically because it's a lunch hour webinar. Really to take that little break to inform yourself, educate yourself, and learn more about really interesting, relevant topics that can help you or can help some of your colleagues, some of your family members, or the community. So if you again have any other questions, feel free to reach out over the next few minutes. I don't think I have any other further questions either. I learned a lot today. I hope you enjoyed it as well, Dr. Funnel.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just end by, not end, but like to sort of say something additional is
Yeah, please. Yeah.
um, that as part of our jobs as developmental psychologists and people that study language development, we love talking about it, obviously, but we also love sharing the information, the scientific information with parents, because it is an ethical responsibility that we see very clearly that we do the science. We're not in this ivory tower, like only doing the science just because, it's on our own. So I always want to say to parents, like, reach out to your nearest university, see if there's any language development people there. We will be more than happy to talk to you about information, things about language development, chat about their language development researchers all over Canada. And pretty much all the universities, you're going to find somebody that focuses on this because it's such an integral part of being human
Right.
that we're so fascinated by it. And how do these babies kick our butts at language development so much
Really?
as
Yeah.
adults, right?
Yeah.
Because me learning, I'm learning Turkish right now, and I'm terrible at it, but I
Yeah.
keep trying. Whereas, if I given this to a baby, they'd be done already. So it's fascinating to us, and so I always want to say that we are more than happy, more than we're overjoyed to talk about it with parents and professionals, of course, as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And that's another big part of it is to talk about it to speech language therapists, to talk to it, with doulas, with general practitioners, because sometimes it's usually general practitioners that might have incorrect information,
Yes.
and they're sharing that information with parents, and that's very frustrating to us on the science side. So we really love getting the information out to people.
Really good reminder.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, I think I'll say thank you again. My sincere thanks on behalf of Treehouse Medical, on behalf of myself and everyone on our team for having you here today. We learned a lot, and we look forward to engaging with you again in the future. So, thank you for your time and for all of your impressive knowledge.
Thank you.
Ty- Typically, Aiden